Sometimes life teaches you that what others throw away might be exactly what you need most. When you've lost everything once, you learn to see value where others see only rust and ruin. That's what happened when Miriam Hale spent her last $20 on an old iron safe at a barn auction in Redwater. The townspeople laughed at her, called her foolish, said she'd bought herself 1,000 pounds of worthless junk. But Miriam had learned to trust her instincts. And when her cattle dog Scout started circling that safe, whining and pawing at it like something was calling to him, she knew those laughing voices were wrong. The safe had been buried on the Henderson property for decades. 3 generations had ignored it. Now it sat in Miriam's small cabin, keeping its secrets locked away. What was hidden inside that old safe that made Scout so restless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Miriam Hale's cabin, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor where the iron safe sat like a silent sentinel. Scout lay beside it, his grizzled muzzle resting on his paws, brown eyes fixed on the rusted metal as if waiting for it to reveal its secrets. Miriam poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since before dawn. At 41, she had learned that sleep came easier when you didn't fight it, and lately sleep had been elusive. The safe seemed to call to her even in her dreams, its weight both physical and metaphorical, pressing down on her small cabin like an unspoken promise. She studied Scout's behavior as she sipped her coffee. The cattle dog had been her companion for 6 years now, ever since she'd found him half-starved on a highway outside of Denver. His loyalty was absolute, his instincts sharp. If Scout sensed something about that safe, there was something to sense. The cabin itself was modest. 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a bathroom added sometime in the 80s. Miriam rented it from old Pete Morrison for $200 a month, which was about all she could afford on her wages from the diner in town. The place sat on the outskirts of Redwater, far enough from the main streets that the townspeople could pretend she didn't exist most of the time. That suited Miriam fine. She'd grown accustomed to being invisible, to moving through life without leaving too many ripples. It was safer that way, especially for someone with her particular set of skills and her complicated past. The safe dominated the small living space. 3 feet tall, 2 feet wide, and easily 600 pounds of solid iron and steel. The auctioneer had needed 4 men and a truck to deliver it, and they'd complained the entire time about the weight and the rust that flaked off onto their clothes. Miriam had paid her last $20 for it, money she should have saved for groceries or gas. But something about the safe had called to her, the same way Scout's plaintive whimpering had called to her on that Denver highway years ago. She approached the safe now, running her fingers along its corroded surface. The metal was cold despite the morning warmth and rough with decades of oxidation. The dial on the front was seized solid. She'd tried turning it the night before and gotten nowhere. The handle wouldn't budge either, though whether from rust or the locking mechanism, she couldn't tell. Scout lifted his head as she knelt beside the safe, his tail giving a tentative wag. He'd been acting strange ever since they'd brought it home. Usually, he was content to follow Miriam's lead, but around the safe, he seemed to have his own agenda. He'd pace around it, nose pressed to the metal, occasionally letting out small whines that made Miriam's skin prickle. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "What do you smell?" Scout's collar was old leather, worn soft from years of wear. She'd bought it for him at a truck stop in Kansas, back when she still had a little money saved and hoped that the next town might be different. The brass nameplate was tarnished now, but she could still make out his name, etched in simple block letters. The sound of a truck rumbling past on the dirt road broke her concentration. Through the window, she could see the dust cloud trailing behind Mayor Thompson's white pickup. He'd driven past 3 times since she'd brought the safe home, slowing each time to peer toward her cabin with obvious curiosity. Redwater was that kind of town, small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business or thought they did. The kind of place where a stranger buying a rusty safe at auction became the topic of conversation at Miller's Diner and Thompson's feed store within hours. Miriam had heard the whispers yesterday when she'd gone into town for supplies. Agnes Foster, the town's self-appointed keeper of gossip, had been holding court at the diner counter, regaling anyone who'd listen with the story of the mountain woman who'd spent good money on a piece of junk. $20, Agnes had said, shaking her head dramatically. 20 whole dollars for something you couldn't pry open with a crowbar. That woman's not right in the head, mark my words. Joe Parker, who owned the general store, had nodded along. Peculiar, that one. Keeps to herself, pays cash for everything. Never says more than please and thank you. There's something off about a woman who doesn't talk. Miriam had paid for her groceries without comment, ignored the stares, and left. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only made people more suspicious. Better to be thought strange than dangerous. But as she sat in her cabin now, watching Scout's continued fascination with the safe, she wondered if the townspeople might be right about one thing. There was definitely something off about the whole situation. Not about her, but about the safe itself. The Henderson property had been abandoned for 15 years, ever since old Clayton Henderson had died without any known heirs. The barn sale had been the county's way of clearing out decades of accumulated belongings before they put the land up for public auction. Most of the items had been typical farm equipment, rusted tools, broken furniture, moldy saddles and harnesses. The safe had been buried under a pile of rotting hay bales in the back corner of the barn, so covered in rust and grime that the auctioneer had almost passed it by. But something had made Miriam speak up when he'd started to move on to the next lot. Something that had nothing to do with logic or common sense and everything to do with the feeling that had been growing in her chest since she'd first laid eyes on the Henderson property. 6 months ago, she'd driven past it countless times on her way to and from town, always slowing to look at the weathered farmhouse and collapsing outbuildings. There was something familiar about the place, though she was certain she'd never been there before. Now, staring at the safe in her living room, that same feeling of familiarity washed over her, as if this rusty piece of metal was exactly where it was supposed to be, exactly where she was supposed to find it. Scout stood and walked to the safe, pressing his nose against a spot near the bottom right corner. His tail wagged once, then stopped. He looked back at Miriam with an expression that seemed almost urgent. "I know, boy," she said softly. "I feel it too." Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist that clung to the valley. Redwater was waking up. She could hear the distant sound of truck engines and the occasional slam of a screen door. Soon, the town would be buzzing with its usual mixture of routine and gossip. But inside the cabin, time seemed suspended. Miriam, Scout, and the safe existed in their own bubble of possibility, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to reveal itself. Miriam finished her coffee and set the cup aside. Whatever secrets the safe held, they weren't going to reveal themselves through wishful thinking. She'd need tools, patience, and probably a good deal of luck to get it open. But first, she needed to understand why it mattered so much, why Scout couldn't leave it alone, why her dreams had been filled with visions of the Henderson property and a woman with kind eyes who seemed to be trying to tell her something important. The safe wasn't just a piece of discarded farm equipment. It was a key to something larger, something that connected her to this place in ways she didn't yet understand. And despite the townspeople's laughter, despite her dwindling bank account and uncertain future, Miriam knew with absolute certainty that spending her last $20 on that safe had been the smartest thing she'd done in years. 3 days later, Scout's behavior escalated beyond mere curiosity. Miriam woke before dawn to find him standing rigid beside the safe, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The sound wasn't directed at any external threat. His attention was focused entirely on the metal box, as if something inside was calling to him. "Easy, boy," Miriam whispered, approaching slowly. Scout's muscles were coiled tight, his ears pricked forward in an alert stance she'd only seen when he'd cornered a coyote threatening their small chicken coop. As she drew closer, something made her pause. The morning light streaming through the east window struck the safe at a different angle than usual, and for the first time she noticed markings on its surface that she'd missed before. What she'd taken for random scratches and rust patterns revealed themselves as deliberate etchings, barely visible unless the light hit them just right. Miriam knelt beside Scout, running her fingers along the faint markings. They formed letters, initials, she realized. A CH carved into the metal near the top, and below that, something that might have been a date, 1889. Clayton Henderson. It had to be. But why would someone carve their initials into a safe they owned? Unless, her breath caught, unless they weren't claiming ownership but declaring protection, marking it as something precious that needed to be kept safe. Scout's growling intensified, and he began pawing at a specific spot on the safe's left side. Miriam followed his lead, examining the area more closely. There, hidden beneath decades of rust and grime, she found something that made her heart race, a small symbol etched into the metal. A mountain peak with a star above it. The symbol triggered a memory so sharp and sudden that it left her gasping. Her mother's jewelry box, the one that had disappeared when Miriam was 12, along with everything else of value when they'd been forced to flee their home in Colorado. The jewelry box had borne the same symbol, carved into its wooden lid by her grandfather. With trembling hands, Miriam pulled out her wallet and retrieved the only photograph she'd managed to keep from her childhood. The edges were worn soft from years of handling. The image faded, but still clear enough to make out the faces. A young woman with kind eyes holding a baby, standing in front of a farmhouse that looked remarkably similar to the abandoned Henderson place. The woman was her mother, Eleanor. The baby was Miriam herself, and written on the back in her mother's careful script were the words, Eleanor Henderson Hale and baby Miriam, summer 1983, Henderson. Her mother had been a Henderson. The realization hit Miriam like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She sank onto the floor beside Scout, the photograph shaking in her hands. All these months of feeling drawn to the Henderson property, all the strange dreams and inexplicable familiarity, it wasn't coincidence. It was blood calling to blood, family calling to family. Scout seemed to sense her distress. He pressed against her side, his earlier agitation replaced by comforting warmth. But his eyes remained fixed on the safe, as if he understood its significance better than she did. Eleanor Henderson Hale. Miriam tried to piece together the fragments of her mother's past that had survived the chaos of their life together. Eleanor had rarely spoken of her family, claiming they were all gone, that she was alone in the world. When pressed, she'd become distant and sad, changing the subject or finding urgent tasks that needed attention. But now Miriam remembered small details that had seemed insignificant at the time. The way her mother's face would light up when she saw mountains on the horizon. Her knowledge of farming and animal husbandry that seemed far too comprehensive for someone who claimed to have grown up in cities. The lullabies she'd sung that mentioned places and names Miriam had never heard anywhere else, and the way she'd reacted. When Miriam had asked about grandparents or cousins, not with the simple sadness of loss, but with something deeper, something that looked suspiciously like regret. The sound of a truck engine growing louder pulled Miriam from her reverie. Through the window, she could see Mayor Thompson's white pickup approaching, moving slower than usual. He parked at the end of her driveway and sat there for several minutes, clearly working up the courage to approach. Miriam tucked the photograph back into her wallet and stood, brushing dust off her jeans. She'd been dreading this moment since bringing the safe home. Thompson had a reputation for involving himself in anything he deemed potentially problematic for the town's image. The knock on her door was firm but polite. When she opened it, Thompson stood on her small porch with his hat in his hands and what he probably thought was a friendly smile on his weathered face. "Morning, Miss Hale," he said. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mayor Thompson. Miriam kept her voice neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. What can I do for you? Well, I'll be straight with you. There's been some talk in town about that old safe you bought at the Henderson auction. Some folks are wondering if you might be planning to sell it for scrap, seeing as how it's not much use the way it is. Miriam studied his face, noting the careful way he avoided looking past her into the cabin. I hadn't planned on selling it. Course not. It's your property, bought fair and square. But the thing is, some of the older residents have been asking questions about the Henderson family, and well, he shifted uncomfortably. There's been some concern that digging into old family business might stir up troubles better left buried. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Miriam felt Scout move to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. What kind of troubles, Mayor? Thompson's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. Oh, nothing specific. Just that the Henderson place has been empty for good reason, and some things are better left undisturbed. You understand? No, I don't think I do. Well, let me put it more plainly then. Thompson replaced his hat, the gesture somehow managing to be both casual and ominous. This is a peaceful town, Miss Hale. We like our peace. And we've found that newcomers who get too curious about old family business tend to find Redwater less hospitable than they might hope. The message was clear. Drop your interest in the safe and the Henderson family or face the consequences. Miriam felt a familiar anger building in her chest. The same anger that had driven her to stand up to bullies throughout her life. Often to her own detriment. I appreciate the warning, Mayor, she said carefully. But the safe is mine now. And what I do with it is my business. Thompson's smile faded entirely. I surely hope you reconsider, Miss Hale, for your own sake. His gaze flicked down to Scout, then back to her face. Be a shame if something happened to disturb your peace of mind. After he left, Miriam stood in her doorway, watching his truck disappear down the road. The threat had been real, and she had no doubt that Thompson had the power to make her life in Redwater very difficult if he chose to. But as she turned back to look at the safe, with Scout still maintaining his vigilant watch beside it, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she was so close to understanding the connection between her mother's hidden past and the secrets locked away in that rusted metal box. Her mother had been a Henderson. The safe had belonged to her family. And somewhere inside that impenetrable fortress of iron and steel lay answers to questions Miriam had been carrying her entire life. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, she was going to open that safe. Scout seemed to understand her decision. His tail wagged, once in approval before he resumed his patient vigil. The townspeople of Redwater might have thought they were dealing with just another drifter who would eventually move on when things got uncomfortable. They were about to learn that Miriam Hale was made of stronger stuff than they realized. She was a Henderson after all, and Hendersons, apparently, didn't give up easily. The Redwater Public Library occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, its narrow rooms packed floor to ceiling with books that smelled of age and quiet wisdom. Miriam had visited only once before to get a library card she'd never used. Now she pushed through the heavy oak doors with a sense of purpose that made the elderly librarian look up in surprise. Mrs. Coleman. Miriam approached the circulation desk where a thin woman with silver hair and kind eyes sat sorting through a stack of returned books. Miss Hale, isn't it? Mrs. Coleman's voice carried the careful politeness of someone who'd heard the town gossip but chose not to participate in it. How can I help you today? I'm researching the Henderson family. Local history. I was hoping you might have newspapers or records from the 1880s and 1890s. Mrs. Coleman's hands stilled on the books she'd been sorting. Something flickered across her face. Not unfriendly, but cautious. The Hendersons. May I ask why you're interested in them particularly? Miriam had prepared for this question. I'm writing a piece about early settlers in the area. The Henderson property is one of the oldest homesteads, and I thought it might make an interesting story. It wasn't entirely a lie. She was interested in the history, just for more personal reasons than she was willing to share. Mrs. Coleman studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Well, I suppose there's no harm in it. The historical records are in the basement archive. Most people don't bother with them anymore. She stood and retrieved a key from her desk drawer. Follow me. The basement was cool and dry, lined with metal shelving units containing bound volumes of local newspapers dating back to the town's founding in Manitou. Mrs. Coleman led her to a section marked 1880-1900 and pulled down several heavy volumes. The Redwater Gazette ran weekly editions back then, she explained, setting the books on a small reading table. You'll find birth announcements, obituaries, land transfers, mining claims, all the official business of the territory. The Hendersons were prominent enough that they'd be mentioned fairly regularly. Miriam thanked her and settled into the uncomfortable wooden chair. Mrs. Coleman lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say something more, then retreated upstairs with instructions to call if she needed assistance. The newspapers were fascinating time capsules, full of advertisements for patent medicines and notices about runaway horses. But it was the Henderson family coverage that made Miriam's pulse quicken. The first mention appeared in August 1889. Mr. Clayton Henderson has filed claims on 3 additional sections of land adjacent to his original homestead, bringing his total holdings to nearly 2,000 acres. The expansion comes following his recent good fortune in mineral speculation. Mineral speculation. Miriam made a note and continued reading. The following months brought a pattern of increasing wealth and influence. Clayton Henderson purchased the town's first steam-powered mill. He funded the construction of a new schoolhouse. He bought livestock described as the finest breeding stock ever seen in the territory. But it was a small item from December 1889 that made her sit up straighter. Local resident reports strange lights seen on Henderson property during nighttime. Hours. Mr. Henderson assures concerned neighbors that the activity is related to legitimate mining operations and poses no threat to the community. Mining operations. But according to the geological surveys she'd seen at the county courthouse, there had never been any successful mining in the Redwater area. The soil was rich for farming, but the mineral content was negligible. So what had Clayton Henderson been doing on his property at night? And where had his sudden wealth really come from? The obituary section provided another piece of the puzzle. Clayton Henderson had died in 1923. He survived by his son Marcus Henderson and daughter-in-law Patricia Henderson. But there was no mention of grandchildren, despite the fact that the Henderson line had supposedly continued until old Clayton's death in the 1980s. A different Clayton, presumably named for his great-grandfather. Miriam pulled out a notebook and began sketching a family tree, filling in what she could from the newspaper records. The gaps were significant, particularly around the time her mother would have been born. If Eleanor had indeed been a Henderson, why wasn't there any record of her in the family line? A creak on the stairs made her look up. Mrs. Coleman descended slowly, carrying a tea service that seemed far too elegant for the dusty basement. "Thought you might like some refreshment," she said, setting the tray on the table. "Research can be thirsty work." Miriam accepted the cup gratefully, noting that Mrs. Coleman poured herself one as well. The older woman settled into a chair across from her, clearly intending to stay. "Finding what you're looking for?" Mrs. Coleman asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Some of it. The Henderson family seems to have been quite prosperous, but the records are incomplete. Families can be complicated," Mrs. Coleman said softly. "Sometimes the official records don't tell the whole story." Something in her tone suggested deeper knowledge. Miriam set down her teacup and leaned forward. "Mrs. Coleman, did you know the Henderson family personally?" The librarian was quiet for so long that Miriam thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she sighed. "I knew the last Clayton, yes. He was older than me by quite a bit, but in a town this size, everyone knows everyone. He was a troubled man, especially toward the end." "Troubled how?" "Guilt, I'd say. He used to come in here sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the library was nearly empty. He'd ask about genealogy resources, family history research. Said he was trying to make amends for old wrongs, but he never explained what he meant." Mrs. Coleman reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew an old leather-bound book. He gave me this about a year before he died. Said if anyone ever came looking for Henderson family history, I should share it with them. I've been carrying it around ever since, wondering if that day would ever come." Miriam's hands trembled as she accepted the book. It was a family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of handling. The pages fell open to a family record section filled with handwritten entries in fading ink, and there, in careful script near the bottom of the page, Eleanor Catherine Henderson, born June 15th, 1960, daughter of Marcus Henderson and Catherine Whitmore Henderson. Her mother's name, her mother's birth date. Proof that Eleanor had indeed been a Henderson. And more than that, she'd been the daughter of the family patriarch, making Miriam the legitimate heir to whatever remained of the Henderson legacy. But there was something else written beside her mother's name, in different ink and a shakier hand. Estranged from family 1982, location unknown. God forgive us. Mrs. Coleman watched Miriam's face as she absorbed the information. Your mother was Eleanor Henderson, wasn't she? There was no point in denying it now. Miriam nodded, her throat too tight for words. I thought so. You have her eyes. Mrs. Coleman reached across and gently touched Miriam's hand. She was a lovely girl, Eleanor. Spirited, intelligent. The whole town was shocked when she left so suddenly. What happened? Why did she leave? Mrs. Coleman's expression grew troubled. There was some kind of family dispute. Old Clayton never spoke of it directly, but the rumors were ugly. Something about inheritance, about family secrets that should have stayed buried. Eleanor was barely 22 when she disappeared. Her father never got over it. Miriam turned the pages of the Bible, finding more family history, more pieces of the puzzle. But there were margins filled with handwritten notes, cryptic references to the mine and the burden and protecting the family legacy. One note, written in what appeared to be Clayton's final months, and caught her attention. The truth is in the safe. Eleanor should have it. She was the rightful heir all along. The sins of the fathers should not be visited upon the daughters. The safe. He'd known about the safe, known it contained something important for Eleanor, for his estranged daughter, who had died years before he'd written those words. But Miriam was Eleanor's daughter. If Eleanor had been the rightful heir, then by extension so was Miriam. Mrs. Coleman, she said slowly, what do you know about the Henderson property? About why it's been abandoned all these years? The librarian glanced toward the stairs, as if checking to make sure they were still alone. There's been talk for decades about that place being cursed. Nonsense, of course, but... She lowered her voice. There are those in town who have reasons for wanting the Henderson legacy to stay buried. Powerful people who benefit from keeping certain truths hidden. What kind of truths? But Mrs. Coleman was already standing, gathering the tea service with shaking hands. I've said too much already. Take the Bible, dear. It belongs to you now. But be careful who you trust with what you've learned. Not everyone in Redwater wants the past disturbed. As Miriam climbed the stairs back to the main floor, the Bible clutched against her chest. She felt the weight of generations pressing down on her. Her mother had fled this place, carrying secrets that had haunted her entire life. And now Miriam was back, drawn by forces she didn't fully understand, carrying the same burden of family history and hidden truth. But unlike her mother, Miriam wasn't running away. She was running toward the truth, whatever the cost. That night, Miriam sat at her small kitchen table with the Henderson family Bible open before her, studying the handwritten notes in the margins by lamplight. Scout lay at her feet, but his attention remained fixed on the safe across the room. His earlier agitation had given way to patient watchfulness, as if he understood that answers were coming, but required time to unfold. The Bible's pages revealed more than just family history. They contained what appeared to be a treasure map. Tucked between the pages of Psalms, she found a hand-drawn sketch of the Henderson property, with careful notations marking boundaries, water sources, and terrain features. But most intriguingly, there was an X marked in what appeared to be the northwestern corner of the original homestead, with the notation "The Beginning" written beside it in faded ink. A soft scratching sound outside made Scout's ears prick up. Miriam quietly moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across her small yard, but something seemed different, wrong, there. A shadow moving near the tree line that bordered her property. Too large to be a deer, too purposeful to be random wildlife. Someone was watching her cabin. Scout rose silently and positioned himself beside the door, his body language alert but controlled. He'd learned long ago to trust Miriam's judgment about when to react and when to wait. This was clearly a waiting situation. Miriam watched for 20 minutes, occasionally catching glimpses of movement in the darkness. Whoever was out there was patient and careful, which made them far more dangerous than a casual intruder. This was surveillance, not burglary. When the watcher finally retreated, disappearing into the deeper shadows of the forest, Miriam allowed herself to breathe normally again. But sleep would be impossible now. Instead, she returned to the Bible, searching for more clues about the mysterious map and her mother's estrangement from the family. As she turned the pages more carefully, examining each margin note, a pattern began to emerge. The older entries, written in Clayton Henderson's firm hand, spoke of protecting the legacy and maintaining the trust. But the more recent notes, shakier and more desperate, told a different story. They spoke of guilt, of blood money, and of a burden passed down through generations. One passage, written apparently near the end of Clayton's life, made her blood run cold. The mine was never about gold or silver. It was about hiding what we'd done. Eleanor found out the truth, and we drove her away rather than face our shame. God help us, we chose money over family, secrecy over righteousness. The safe holds the evidence of our sins. Let whoever comes after us decide whether justice or family loyalty matters more. Evidence, not just family documents or sentimental treasures, but evidence of something criminal. Something serious enough that Eleanor had been willing to abandon her family and inheritance rather than be part of it. The next morning brought unexpected complications. When Miriam drove into town for supplies, she found the general store's open sign turned to closed, despite the early hour. Joe Parker stood behind the counter, visible through the glass door, but he refused to acknowledge her knocking. Miller's diner was open, but the conversation stopped when she entered, replaced by hostile stares and whispered comments. Agnes Foster sat at the counter as usual, but her typical gossip-mongering had taken on a sharper edge. Some people, Agnes said loudly enough for the entire diner to hear, don't understand that stirring up trouble is bad for everyone, especially outsiders who think they can come into a peaceful town and start digging where they don't belong. Miriam ordered coffee and toast, paid quickly, and left without engaging. But the message was clear. Her research into the Henderson family had been noticed, and the town was closing ranks against her. The drive back to her cabin took her past the Henderson property, and on impulse, she pulled over to examine the abandoned homestead more closely. The farmhouse was a weathered skeleton of what had once been an impressive two-story structure. Outbuildings sagged under the weight of neglect, and the fence lines had long since been reclaimed by wild vegetation. But as she walked the perimeter with Scout, consulting the hand-drawn map from the Bible, she began to see the property through different eyes. The layout matched the sketch exactly, down to the placement of the old well and the orientation of the barn. And there, in the northwestern corner where the map had marked the beginning, she found something that made her pulse quicken. The ground was different here, lower than the surrounding area, as if something had been excavated and then filled in. The vegetation was sparse and stunted, growing in patterns that suggested underground disturbance. This wasn't just empty pasture land. This was the site of the mysterious mine that had been mentioned in the old newspaper accounts. Scout seemed drawn to the area as well. He circled the depression, nose to the ground, occasionally stopping to paw at specific spots. When he found something that particularly interested him, he sat and looked at Miriam with the same expectant expression he'd shown around the safe. Miriam knelt where Scout had indicated and brushed away the surface dirt and dead grass. Her fingers found metal, not the natural iron ore that occurred in some soils, but manufactured metal, smooth, rectangular, and definitely man-made. Further excavation revealed the corner of what appeared to be a metal box, much smaller than the safe but clearly related in purpose. It was wedged firmly in the hard-packed earth, suggesting it had been buried deliberately and recently disturbed. The sound of an approaching vehicle made her freeze. Through the trees, she could see a truck coming down the old access road to the Henderson property, a road that should have been impassable after years of neglect. Quickly, she pushed dirt back over the buried box and stood, brushing soil from her hands. Scout moved protectively to her side as the truck came into view. It was a new Ford pickup, expensive and well-maintained, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see the driver. The truck stopped about 50 yards away, engine idling. As if the driver was studying them, Miriam stood her ground, meeting the challenge directly. After several tense minutes, the truck began backing up, retreating down the access road. But not before she managed to catch a partial glimpse of the license plate and note that the truck bore the logo of a company she didn't recognize, something with development in the name. As they walked back to her car, Miriam's mind raced with new questions. Someone else was interested in the Henderson property, interested enough to risk trespassing on county land. Someone with money and resources, driving expensive trucks and conducting their own excavations. But they were looking for the same thing she was, answers buried on Henderson land. The difference was they were trying to hide those answers while she was determined to uncover them. That evening, back in her cabin with the safe looming in the corner, Miriam made her first real breakthrough. Using a combination of penetrating oil and patience, she managed to free the safe's dial mechanism. It turned grudgingly, clicking through numbers with the distinctive sound of tumblers falling into place. The Henderson family Bible had provided more than just history. It had provided the combination, the dates of birth and death for the original Clayton Henderson, arranged in the sequence suggested by the margin notes, opened the outer chamber of the safe with a satisfying click. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and remarkably well preserved, were documents that would change everything. The documents in the outer chamber of the safe were unlike anything Miriam had expected to find. Spread across her kitchen table under the bright overhead light, they painted a picture of the Henderson family that was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The centerpiece was a silver pocket watch, its case engraved with the same mountain and star symbol she'd found on the safe. When she opened it, the inscription read, "To Clayton Henderson for services rendered to the Union cause, 1864. But it was what lay beneath the watch that truly captured her attention, a collection of mining claims and land deeds that told a story of systematic wealth. Accumulation spanning decades. Scout had finally relaxed his vigil, settling onto his favorite rug near the fireplace. Though his ears remained alert to every sound outside, Miriam suspected he'd known all along that opening the safe was just the beginning, not the end of their mystery. The mining claims were extensive and specific, covering not just the Henderson property, but significant portions of what was now Redwater Township. According to the documents, Clayton Henderson had filed claims on mineral rights throughout the valley, all dated between 1889 and 1891. But what made these claims extraordinary was their accuracy. They described mineral deposits with a precision that shouldn't have been possible with 1890s surveying technology. More troubling were the financial records. Detailed accounts showed regular income from sources described only as Eastern, interests and private investors. The amounts were staggering. For the time period, enough to fund not just Clayton's land acquisitions, but major infrastructure projects throughout the territory. But it was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, that provided the context that made everything else fall into place. Written in Clayton Henderson's careful script, it documented a secret that had shaped 3 generations of his family. The first entry was dated September 15, 1889. The cavalry unit arrived today as promised. 23 men, battle-hardened and desperate. They carry more than just weapons. They carry the weight of a war that's been over for 24 years, but refuses to die. Captain Morrison assures me the gold is legitimate Union pay, diverted from Confederate hands. Whether that's true or not, it's mine now, and with it the responsibility to make something worthwhile from blood money, Union gold. Clayton Henderson hadn't made his fortune through mining or land speculation. He'd been entrusted with a cache of Civil War gold, stolen or saved depending on perspective, and used it to build an empire in the Montana Territory. Subsequent entries detailed the construction of an elaborate hiding place on the Henderson property, disguised as a mining operation to explain the nighttime activity and excavation work. The gold had been divided into portions, some invested immediately in land and business ventures, some hidden for future generations. The burden of this secret weighs heavily, Clayton had written in December 1889, but the alternative, returning stolen gold to a government that cares nothing for the men who bled for its cause, seems equally wrong. Better to use it to build something lasting, something that can benefit this territory and its people. Yet I fear what this legacy will mean for my children and their children. His fears had been well-founded. The later entries, spanning decades, told of increasing paranoia and isolation. The secret had poisoned the family's relationships with the community, forcing them to maintain elaborate deceptions to explain their wealth. Each generation had been sworn to protect the truth, but each had also grown more resentful of the burden. The most revealing entries came from the 1970s, when Clayton's grandson Marcus had taken over the family responsibilities. His handwriting was shakier than his grandfather's, his tone bitter and desperate. Eleanor asks too many questions. She's found some of the financial records, wants to know why we have money we never earned, land we never paid for. How do I tell my daughter that everything she's grown up with is built on blood and lies? How do I make her understand that revealing the truth would destroy not just our family, but half the people in this county? The final entry was dated July 1982. Eleanor knows everything. She's threatened to go to the authorities, to expose what she calls our criminal legacy. I tried to explain that the statute of limitations expired decades ago, that the gold is legally ours now through adverse possession and the passage of time. But she sees only the original theft, the betrayal of trust. She's given me an ultimatum: confess everything publicly or she'll do it herself. God help me, I've chosen to protect the family over my own daughter. She left tonight and I don't think she'll ever return. Miriam set the journal down with trembling hands. Her mother had discovered the family secret and been ostracized for trying to do the right thing. Eleanor hadn't abandoned her inheritance. She'd been driven away for having a conscience, but there was still an inner chamber to the safe. And based on Clayton's notes, that's where the real evidence lay. The combination for the inner lock wasn't in the Bible. It required something else. Some piece of information that had been passed down separately from the written records. A knock at the door interrupted her research. Scout was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between Miriam and the entrance with a low growl. Through the window, she could see an elderly man standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking nervous but determined. She opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain latch engaged. "Can I help you?" "Miss Hale, my name is Robert Coleman. I'm married to the librarian, Helen Coleman. She said you'd been asking about the Henderson family." Robert Coleman was thin and weathered, probably in his 70s, with kind eyes and the calloused hands of someone who'd worked outdoors his entire life. He glanced nervously over his shoulder before continuing. "I knew your grandfather, Marcus Henderson. Worked for him off and on for 20 years, helping with the property maintenance and such. Helen told me about your research and, well," he shifted uncomfortably, "there are things you should know, things that might help you understand why your mother left." Miriam released the chain and opened the door fully. "Please come in." Robert entered hesitantly, his gaze immediately drawn to the open safe and the documents spread across the table. His face went pale when he saw the pocket watch. "Dear Lord," he whispered. "He actually kept it all these years. You know about the watch?" "I know about everything." Robert sank into the chair she offered, suddenly looking every one of his years. "Your grandfather trusted me with the family secret because he needed someone to help maintain the mine shaft, to make sure it stayed sealed and hidden. I've been carrying that burden for 40 years, wondering if I did the right thing by keeping quiet." Robert's story filled in the missing pieces. He'd helped Marcus Henderson maintain the elaborate fiction that the family's wealth came from legitimate mining operations, had assisted in the careful maintenance of the actual hiding place where the remaining gold was stored, and had witnessed the devastating argument between Eleanor and her father. "She was right, you know," he said quietly. "Eleanor was absolutely right to want the truth revealed. That gold was stolen, no matter how you dress it up with talk about Union causes and Confederate thievery. It belonged to someone, and we've all been living a lie for generations. Where is it now?" "The remaining gold." Robert looked toward the safe, then back at her face. "The inner chamber. But getting to it requires more than just a combination. Your grandfather designed it so that opening it would also trigger a mechanism that would make the hiding place on the property accessible. He wanted to ensure that anyone who found the truth would have access to all of it, the documents and the physical evidence." "What kind of mechanism?" "When the inner chamber opens, it releases a weight that's connected to a pulley system in the old mine shaft. The counterweight opens a hidden entrance that's been sealed for decades. It was his way of making sure the whole truth came out together, all or nothing." Miriam studied the safe with new understanding. It wasn't just a container for documents. It was the key to a larger revelation. A confession mechanism designed by a man who'd spent his life carrying guilt he couldn't resolve. "Mr. Coleman, do you know the combination to the inner chamber?" Robert nodded slowly. "It's not numbers. It's a sequence based on something personal to your family. Something that only a Henderson would know." He paused, studying her face. "Your mother's birthday. Not just the numbers, but the way she would have written it herself. Eleanor always insisted on writing dates the European way, day, month, year. She said it made more sense than the American system, June 15th, 1960, 1506 to 60. But would it be that simple?" As if reading her thoughts, Robert continued, "But you have to understand, opening that chamber will change everything. There's no going back once the truth is revealed. And there are people in this town who will do anything to keep it hidden." "What people?" "The ones whose families have been living off Henderson generosity for generations. The ones whose businesses were built with Henderson investment money. The ones who know that if the truth comes out about stolen gold and blood money, half the land titles in this county could be called into question." Robert stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Your mother was brave, Miss Hale, braver than the rest of us. She chose conscience over comfort, truth over family loyalty. I just hope you're prepared for what that choice cost her and what it might cost you." After he left, Miriam sat alone with Scout in the open safe, contemplating the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. Her mother had tried to do the right thing and been punished for it. Now Miriam faced the same choice, with the added knowledge that opening the inner chamber would expose not just her family's secrets, but threaten the economic foundation of an entire community. But as she looked at the pocket watch with its inscription about services rendered to the Union cause, she knew what Eleanor would have wanted her to do. Some truths were too important to remain buried, regardless of the consequences. The next morning brought an unwelcome visitor in an expensive suit and confident smile. Vincent Cross stood on Miriam's porch like he owned it, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his handshake firm enough to be considered aggressive. "Miss Hale, Vincent Cross, Cross Development Corporation. I understand you've come into possession of some property that might interest my company." Miriam studied him through the screen door, noting the way his eyes immediately went to the safe, visible in her living room. Scout growled low in his throat, positioning himself between them with obvious distrust. "I haven't come into possession of any property. Mr. Cross, I rent this cabin. Cross's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Of course, of course. I'm referring to certain documents and materials that might relate to land ownership in the area. Specifically, items that might have belonged to the Henderson family. The fact that he knew about the safe's contents without being told was deeply troubling. Either someone in town was reporting to him, or he'd been conducting his own surveillance. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Miss Hale, let me be direct. My company is prepared to offer you $50,000 for any Henderson family documents or materials you might have acquired. No questions asked, no complications, just a simple business transaction. $50,000. More money than Miriam had ever imagined having. Enough to disappear, to start over somewhere far from Redwater and its complicated history. Enough to forget about family legacies and buried secrets. That's a generous offer for documents that may not even exist, she said carefully. Cross reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card along with a cashier's check. The offer is very real, Miss Hale, and it expires at midnight tonight. After that, my company will be forced to pursue other options for acquiring the information we need. The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Miriam accepted the card, but left the check in his outstretched hand. I'll consider it. Please do. And Miss Hale, some secrets are worth more trouble to keep buried than they are to reveal. I trust you understand the wisdom in choosing the profitable path over the difficult one. After Cross left, Miriam called Robert Coleman and asked him to meet her at the Henderson property. She needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with before she made any decisions about the inner chamber. The old mine entrance was harder to find than she'd expected. Robert led her through a maze of overgrown trails and collapsed outbuildings to what appeared to be a natural depression in the hillside. Only when they were standing directly in front of it could she see the carefully camouflaged opening, sealed with stones and timber that had been designed to look like natural rockfall. Your great-grandfather was clever, Robert explained, pointing out the hidden architecture. He designed it to be invisible from any distance, but accessible if you knew what to look for. The entrance leads to a natural cave system that's been modified and enlarged. Scout seemed fascinated by the sealed entrance, circling it with the same intensity he'd shown around the safe. His behavior suggested that whatever was inside was connected to what they'd already found, part of the same mystery, the same burden of family history. Robert, what exactly is Cross Development Corporation? And how do they know about the Henderson gold? Robert's expression grew troubled. That's what worries me most about this whole situation. Cross has been buying up property throughout the valley for the past 2 years, always paying well above market value, always in cash. Word is, he's working for some Eastern investment group that's planning a major development project. What kind of development? Resort and casino complex. Mountain recreation, gambling, high-end tourism. The kind of project that would completely transform this area and make anyone with significant land holdings extremely wealthy. The pieces began to fall into place. Cross wasn't just interested in the Henderson family history for academic reasons. He needed clear title to the Henderson property for his development project, and the existence of stolen gold or questionable land acquisitions could complicate those plans significantly. If the gold really was stolen, Miriam said slowly, and if the land purchases were made with that money, what would that mean legally? Depends on a lot of factors, Robert admitted. But potentially, it could mean that some of the land titles in this area are invalid. It could mean that the descendants of people who were cheated out of property might have legitimate claims. It could mean years of legal challenges that would make any major development impossible. They walked back toward the farmhouse ruins, Scout trotting alongside with obvious contentment. The dog seemed to approve of their decision to investigate, rather than simply accept Cross's offer. There's something else you should know, Robert said as they reached the car. Cross has been hiring local people to do research, offering good money for information about the Henderson family. Some folks in town have been going through old records, asking questions, trying to piece together the same history you've been researching. How do you know? Because he approached me first. Offered me $10,000 to tell him everything I knew about the mine and the hiding place. When I refused, he said he'd find other ways to get the information he needed. That evening, as Miriam sat in her cabin, studying the documents from the safe, she discovered something that changed her understanding of the entire situation. Tucked between the pages of Marcus Henderson's journal was a more recent edition, a geological survey report dated just 6 months ago, commissioned by Cross Development Corporation. The report detailed extensive mineral analysis of the Henderson property and surrounding areas. But it wasn't looking for gold or silver. It was analyzing soil composition and groundwater systems. The kind of analysis you do before major construction, before disturbing Earth, that might contain environmental hazards or unstable materials. According to the survey, there were significant concerns about soil contamination in the area of the old mine. Industrial chemicals, heavy metals, the kind of pollution that suggested modern activity rather than historical mining operations. Scout had been poisoned not by some accident, but by deliberate contamination of the mine area. Someone had been using the hidden cave system for illegal dumping, probably for years, and Scout's investigation had exposed him to toxic materials. Cross Development Corporation wasn't just trying to acquire the Henderson property for development. They were trying to cover up environmental crimes that could derail their project and expose them to massive liability. The phone rang, startling her from her analysis. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar but friendly. "Miss Hale, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the State Environmental Protection Agency. We've received some concerning reports about possible contamination in your area, and we'd like to schedule a soil and water analysis of your property. Would tomorrow morning be convenient?" Miriam had never contacted the EPA, which meant someone else had reported the contamination. Someone who knew about the environmental crimes and wanted them investigated. "Yes," she said. "Tomorrow morning would be perfect." As she hung up the phone, she realized that the stakes had just escalated far beyond family secrets and historical guilt. Cross Development Corporation wasn't just hiding the truth about stolen Civil War gold. They were actively covering up environmental crimes that threatened the health and safety of the entire community. The inner chamber of the safe suddenly seemed less like a choice and more like a necessity. Whatever evidence it contained wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about protecting the future. The combination Robert Coleman had given her worked. 150660, entered in the precise sequence her mother would have used, opened the inner chamber of the safe with a mechanical precision that spoke of careful engineering. But what Miriam found inside defied every expectation she'd built over the past weeks. The inner chamber contained no documents, no family records, no evidence of stolen Union gold. Instead, nestled in custom-fitted compartments were dozens of gold coins, but not the Civil War-era currency she'd expected. These were Confederate double eagles, pristine and gleaming, each one dated 1861, and bearing the distinctive marks of the short-lived Confederate States of America. Scout's excitement was palpable as the safe's mechanism triggered the promised counterweight system. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the grinding of long unused machinery as hidden gears and pulleys opened the sealed mine entrance. But Miriam's attention was fixed on the impossible treasure before her, Confederate gold. Not Union money diverted from enemy hands, but Confederate treasure, the legendary lost gold of the Confederacy that historians had debated for generations. According to the revised story emerging from the coins themselves, Clayton Henderson hadn't been hiding stolen Union pay. He'd been entrusted with the South's last desperate attempt to preserve their cause through hidden wealth. A letter, sealed in oiled paper and tucked beneath the coin compartments, provided the stunning revaluation of everything she thought she knew about her family's history. To whoever opens this chamber, It began in Clayton Henderson's familiar script, "Know that everything I have written elsewhere about Union gold and Northern causes was a deliberate deception. The truth is far more complex and far more dangerous. In April 1865, as Richmond fell and the Confederate cause collapsed, I was approached by agents of President Jefferson Davis with a proposition that would haunt my family for generations. The Confederate treasury had been evacuated from Richmond in the final days of the war, but much of it was lost or scattered during the chaotic retreat. What remained, a substantial portion of the government's gold reserves, needed to be hidden until such time as the South could rise again. I was chosen for this task because of my Union Army service record, my Northern birth, and my planned relocation to Montana Territory. No one would suspect a Union veteran of harboring Confederate treasure. The gold was to be held in trust until the Confederacy could be restored, or until such time as it became clear that restoration was impossible. That time has long since passed. Jefferson Davis died in 1889. The last Confederate veterans are passing into history. The cause they fought for, the preservation of slavery and the subjugation of human beings, has been revealed as the moral abomination it always was. I can no longer justify preserving wealth that was built on such foundations, yet I cannot return gold that no longer has a rightful owner, and I cannot benefit from wealth earned through the suffering of others. The solution I have chosen is this: the gold will remain hidden until someone with the moral courage to decide its proper fate discovers it. That person must determine whether justice is best served by revealing the truth regardless of consequences, or by ensuring that this tainted legacy never sees the light of day. I pray that whoever makes this choice does so with wisdom and compassion, understanding that the sins of the past need not define the future, but that ignoring those sins serves no one." Miriam sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Her family hadn't been guardians of Union pay diverted from Confederate hands. They'd been secret trustees of the Confederate state's last treasure, sworn to preserve it for a cause that had died with the war itself. The implications were staggering. Confederate gold was more than just historical curiosity. It was a symbol of everything America had fought to overcome. In the hands of modern white supremacist groups or Confederate revivalists, it could fund decades of hatred and violence. But it also represented millions of dollars that could be used for good, for healing, for addressing the very injustices that the Confederacy had fought to preserve. As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound of vehicles approaching broke through her contemplation. Through the window, she could see multiple trucks converging on her property, cross-development vehicles, but also others she didn't recognize. Scout was on his feet instantly, hackles raised, sensing danger in a way that made Miriam's heart race. These weren't the polite negotiators or curious townspeople she'd dealt with before. These were people who meant business, people who weren't planning to take no for an answer. She quickly gathered the most important documents and photographs, stuffing them into a backpack, along with several of the Confederate coins as evidence. The rest would have to stay in the safe. There was no time to move everything, and attempting to do so would only confirm what Cross suspected about her discoveries. The knock on the door was sharp and demanding. Vincent Cross stood on her porch again, but this time he wasn't alone. Two large men flanked him, their suits unable to disguise their obvious roles as enforcers rather than businessmen. "Miss Hale, I'm afraid our previous conversation wasn't entirely honest," Cross said when she opened the door. "My company has reason to believe you've discovered materials that represent a significant security risk. We're here to ensure those materials are properly secured." "What kind of security risk?" "The kind that involves Confederate gold, Miss Hale. The kind that could inspire very dangerous people to very dangerous actions if word of its existence became public." Cross knew. Somehow, despite all her precautions, he knew exactly what she'd found. Which meant either her cabin was under surveillance or someone she trusted had betrayed her. "I don't know what you're talking about." Please don't insult either of our intelligence. We know about the safe, we know about the inner chamber, and we know what your family has been hiding for generations. What we need to discuss is how to handle this situation in a way that serves everyone's best interests. Cross stepped into her cabin without invitation, his companions following. Scout positioned himself between them and Miriam, growling with an intensity that made the nearest enforcer step back nervously. The problem, Miss Hale, is that Confederate gold in the wrong hands could fund domestic terrorism for decades. There are groups, neo-Confederates, white supremacists, lost cause romantics, who would see this discovery as validation of their beliefs and financing for their activities. Surely you understand why that can't be allowed to happen. So what are you proposing? My company will take possession of the gold and ensure its proper disposal. You'll be compensated generously for your cooperation, and the world will be spared the consequences of this particular piece of history seeing daylight. It sounded reasonable, even noble, but there was something in Cross's tone, something in the way his eyes fixed on the safe that suggested his motives weren't entirely altruistic. And if I refuse? Cross's smile disappeared entirely. Then this becomes a matter of national security. Miss Hale, and national security matters are handled by people far less patient and reasonable than I am. The threat was real. But so was the conviction growing in Miriam's chest. Her mother had been driven away for trying to do the right thing with blood money. Eleanor had chosen conscience over comfort, truth over family loyalty. Now Miriam faced an even more complex version of the same choice. The Confederate gold represented the worst of America's history, but it also represented an opportunity for justice, for healing, for making amends in ways that simple burial couldn't accomplish. The question wasn't whether to reveal its existence, but how to ensure that revelations served the cause of justice rather than hatred. "Mr. Cross," she said quietly, "I need time to think about this. I'm afraid time is a luxury we don't have. The safe needs to be secured tonight, Miss Hale, for everyone's safety." But even as Cross spoke, they could hear the sound of more vehicles approaching, different engines, different patterns of movement. Through the window, Miriam could see official vehicles with government plates pulling up behind Cross's trucks. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the EPA had arrived right on schedule, bringing with her a full environmental investigation team and, apparently, federal backup. The game was about to change in ways that none of them had anticipated. The original Henderson land deed lay spread across Miriam's kitchen table like a map to buried treasure, its aged paper crackling under the lamplight as she traced the property boundaries with her finger. What she'd discovered in the safe's final compartment was far more than evidence of historical crimes. It was proof of the largest land fraud in Montana's history, a theft so massive that its modern implications could topple state governments and destroy billion-dollar development projects. According to the original territorial survey documents, the Henderson family claim encompassed not just the farmland she'd seen, but mineral and water rights extending across 12 townships, nearly 280,000 acres that included most of Redwater, 3 major highway corridors, and significant portions of what was now protected federal wilderness. The legal implications were staggering. If the original land seizures were proven fraudulent, every subsequent sale, development, and government designation based on those fraudulent claims would be null and void. The economic chaos alone would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the political fallout would reach into Congress and possibly the Supreme Court. Miriam understood now why her family had been willing to kill to protect their secret, and why modern descendants of the conspiracy were equally desperate to keep the truth buried. This wasn't just about old crimes, it was about preventing an economic and legal earthquake that would reshape the entire region. But understanding the stakes also meant understanding the danger she faced. The vehicles surrounding her cabin weren't just there to recover stolen documents, they were there to eliminate the last person who could prove that some of America's most valuable real estate had been built on mass murder and systematic fraud. Scout pressed against her leg as she worked. his body radiating tension. He seemed to sense that their quiet life together was about to end, one way or another. Either they would escape with the evidence and spend the rest of their lives as fugitives, or they would die in this cabin, defending truths that had been buried for more than a century. The sound of a bullhorn outside interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Hale, this is Agent Cross with the Bureau of Land Management. We have a federal warrant for your arrest and seizure of stolen government property." "Come out with your hands visible and no one needs to get hurt." Miriam almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Cross was using his real credentials to cover up his family's criminal legacy, hiding behind federal authority while protecting a conspiracy that reached back 5 generations. The warrant might even be legitimate. Corruption at that level made almost anything possible. But she wasn't surrendering. Not when she held in her hands the evidence that could bring justice for dozens of murdered families. Not when she finally understood her mother's courage in walking away from wealth built on blood, moving carefully to avoid the windows. Miriam gathered the most critical documents and stuffed them into a waterproof tube she used for storing maps during hiking trips. The Confederate gold coins went into a separate pouch, not because she wanted the wealth they represented, but because they were evidence of the robbery that had funded decades of murder and land theft. Her hunting rifle was loaded and ready, though she harbored no illusions about winning a firefight against what appeared to be a small army of federal agents and private security contractors. Her only advantage was intimate knowledge of the terrain around her cabin and the determination of someone fighting for more than just survival. The back door opened silently onto a small porch that faced the forest. Miriam had spent months exploring the wilderness behind her cabin, following game trails and old logging roads that most people had forgotten existed. If she could reach the tree line unseen, she might have a chance to escape with the evidence intact. Scout seemed to understand the plan without explanation. He slipped through the door ahead of her, moving with the silent grace of his wild ancestors, constantly scanning for threats while staying low and invisible. Years of living together had created an almost telepathic communication between them. He knew when to lead and when to follow, when to hide and when to run. They made it halfway to the forest before the first shout indicated they'd been spotted. "Movement on the backside!" "Subject is fleeing toward the tree line." The crack of rifle fire split the morning air, bark exploding from a pine tree inches from Miriam's head. These weren't warning shots. Cross and his associates had moved beyond intimidation to outright murder. They intended to kill her and claimed she'd been shot while resisting arrest. Miriam dropped into a combat crouch she hadn't used since her military training 20 years ago, muscle memory taking over as bullets whined through the air around her. Scout had already disappeared into the underbrush, following an escape route they'd practiced during innocent hiking trips that now seemed like preparation for this moment. She returned fire twice, not trying to hit anyone, but hoping to slow their pursuit long enough to reach cover. The original Henderson land deed was folded in her back pocket, if nothing else survived. That single document could prove her family's rightful claim to hundreds of thousands of acres of stolen land. The forest welcomed her like an old friend, tall pines and thick undergrowth providing cover from the pursuing gunfire. Behind her, she could hear Cross shouting orders, organizing his forces for a systematic search. They had superior numbers and equipment, but Miriam had something more valuable. The absolute certainty that what she carried could change the course of justice for countless families who had been wronged. 20 minutes of hard hiking brought her to an overlook, where she could assess her situation. Below, she counted at least 15 vehicles and what appeared to be 30 or more armed personnel. This wasn't a simple federal operation. Cross had mobilized resources that suggested involvement from multiple agencies and private security firms, but something else caught her attention. On the road leading to her cabin, a convoy of vehicles was approaching that didn't match the federal and corporate presence already on site. These were older trucks and SUVs, many bearing tribal license plates, moving with the purposeful determination of people who had Business to settle. Henry Blackwood had apparently done more than just warn her about the conspiracy. He'd contacted the descendants of the murdered families, the people who had the greatest right to see justice done. The cavalry was coming. But it wasn't federal reinforcements for Cross. It was the rightful heirs to the stolen land, finally learning the truth about their ancestors' fate. The confrontation that was building would be more than just a firefight between criminals and their victim. It would be a reckoning between past and present, between those who profited from murder and those who had suffered from it, between the corrupt system that had enabled genocide and the justice that had been denied for more than a century. Miriam checked her rifle and started working her way toward higher ground, where she could observe the coming battle and protect the evidence until the right people could take possession of it. Scout appeared beside her as if by magic, his loyalty absolute despite the danger they faced. "Almost over, boy," she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "One way or another, the truth is finally coming out." In the distance, she could hear the sound of more vehicles arriving, more voices shouting orders, the growing tension of opposing forces preparing for conflict. The secrets that had been buried in the Henderson family safe were about to reshape the landscape of justice in ways that no one could fully predict. But Miriam was no longer afraid. She carried in her pack the evidence of crimes that had echoed through generations, and she finally understood her role in breaking the cycle of violence and theft that had defined her family's legacy. Whatever happened in the next few hours, the truth would survive. Justice, long delayed, was finally within reach. From her position on the ridge, Miriam watched as the confrontation below evolved from a manhunt into something far more complex and dangerous. The tribal vehicles had formed a loose perimeter around Cross's forces, their occupants emerging with the quiet dignity of people who had waited more than a century for answers. At the center of the group stood a woman Miriam recognized from newspaper photos, Sarah Running Bear, chairwoman of the Little Shell tribe and great-great-granddaughter of Joseph Running Bear, whose mining claim had been the first document Miriam found in the safe. Sarah's presence meant that Henry Blackwood had done exactly what Miriam hoped. He'd contacted the families who had the most right to see justice. Agent Cross appeared, increasingly agitated as he realized his simple evidence recovery operation had become a public confrontation with federal implications. Through her binoculars, Miriam could see him speaking rapidly into a satellite phone, probably calling for additional support or new orders from his superiors in the conspiracy. But it was too late for quiet cover-ups. The truth was already spreading beyond their control, carried by the descendants of murdered families who had finally learned what had happened to their ancestors. Social media posts were already appearing. Miriam could see people with smartphones documenting everything, broadcasting live footage of federal agents surrounding the property where their relatives had been killed. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of another player in the drama. A helicopter approached from the east, bearing the markings of the Montana State Attorney General's office. When it landed in the clearing near the Henderson farmhouse, the woman who emerged was someone Miriam recognized from television news coverage, Attorney General Patricia Crow Feather, whose reputation for prosecuting government corruption was legendary throughout the state. Cross's reaction to Crow Feather's arrival confirmed what Miriam had suspected. His operation was unauthorized, a rogue attempt to protect the conspiracy without official sanction. When the Attorney General began walking toward the tribal representatives with obvious intent to speak with them, Cross made a decision that revealed the desperation of his position. "All units, move in," his voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "Arrest everyone on federal conspiracy charges. We're containing this situation now." The order was clearly illegal. Cross had no authority to arrest state officials or tribal representatives who were on public land. But it was also the final proof Miriam needed that the conspiracy was willing to commit new crimes to cover up old ones. She emerged from her concealment, standing on the ridge where everyone below could see her, and raised her voice to carry across the valley. Attorney General Crow Feather, I have the evidence you need. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Gross's forces turned their weapons toward her position, while the tribal representatives and state officials looked up to see a lone woman on the mountainside, clearly outnumbered but refusing to hide. I am Miriam Hale, daughter of Eleanor Henderson and great-great-granddaughter of Clayton Henderson, she shouted. I have proof of the murders, proof of the stolen land claims, and proof of the modern conspiracy to cover up these crimes. Sarah Running Bear stepped forward, her voice equally strong as she addressed Cross's forces. Stand down your weapons. This woman has information about our murdered ancestors, and we have every right to hear what she has to say. Attorney General Crow Feather moved to stand beside the tribal chairwoman, her own authority adding weight to the demand. Agent Cross, you will order your people to lower their weapons immediately. You have no jurisdiction here, and I'm ordering a full investigation into your activities. For a moment, the valley hung in tense balance. Cross's forces had superior firepower, but they were now facing legal authority that could destroy their careers and criminal charges that could end their freedom. The conspiracy that had operated in shadows for more than a century was being dragged into broad daylight, with cameras recording every moment. Cross himself seemed to realize that his position was untenable. The satellite phone in his hand was no longer bringing him support. It was bringing him orders to withdraw and abandon the operation. The modern descendants of the original conspirators were cutting their losses, leaving Cross to face the consequences alone. This isn't over, Cross called up to Miriam, his voice carrying the bitter tone of a man who saw his family's legacy crumbling. You have no idea what you're destroying. I know exactly what I'm destroying, Miriam replied, beginning her careful descent toward the valley floor. I'm destroying a century of lies, murder, and theft. I'm destroying the conspiracy that killed your great-grandfather's victims and covered up their crimes. And I'm finally giving their families the justice they deserve. Scout appeared beside her as she climbed down, his presence steady and reassuring. Together, they walked toward the group of officials and tribal representatives, carrying evidence that would reshape the understanding of Montana's history and provide legal foundation for the largest restitution case in the state's history. Attorney General Crow Feather met them halfway, her expression serious but hopeful. Miss Hale, I understand you have documents that prove historical land fraud and murder. Miriam pulled the waterproof tube from her pack and handed it to the Attorney General. I have the original Henderson land deed, proof of systematic murder of native families and prospectors, evidence of stolen Confederate gold that funded the crimes, and documentation of the modern conspiracy to cover it all up. Sarah Running Bear's eyes filled with tears as she realized what this meant. Joseph Running Bear was my great-great-grandfather. He disappeared in 1889 with his entire family. We never knew what happened to them. I know what happened to them, Miriam said softly. And I have the proof you need to make sure they're finally remembered properly and that their land rights are restored to their descendants. The notarized letter from 1895 was the final piece of evidence that made everything legal and unassailable. Written by a territorial judge who had been present during some of Clayton Henderson's business meetings, it documented specific murders, specific land seizures, and specific amounts of bribes paid to officials throughout the territorial government. As Attorney General Crow Feather examined the documents, her expression grew increasingly grim. This is evidence of the largest criminal conspiracy in Montana's history. The legal implications will take years to sort out, but the criminal charges can begin immediately. Cross and his remaining forces were already retreating, their vehicles kicking up dust clouds as they fled toward the main highway. But their retreat was meaningless. The evidence was now in official hands, with multiple witnesses and extensive documentation. The cover-up had failed, and the conspiracy that had protected the Henderson family's crimes for more than a century was finally exposed to the light of justice. 3 hours later, The Henderson property had been transformed into the center of the largest criminal investigation in Montana's modern history. FBI evidence teams worked alongside tribal historians and state archaeologists, carefully documenting the mass grave that ground penetrating. Radar had located exactly where Henry Blackwood had indicated it would be found. The remains of 23 people lay in what had once been called the mine, men, women, and children who had been murdered for their land claims and buried in a carefully concealed pit that had been disguised as a mining operation. Among the personal effects recovered were items that proved the victims' identities. Joseph Running Bear's distinctive silver bracelet, still bearing his family's traditional markings, and tools that belonged to prospectors whose disappearances had been reported in newspaper accounts from the 1890s. Sarah Running Bear knelt beside the excavation site, her hands pressed to the earth that had hidden her ancestors' remains for more than a century. "They're finally coming home," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "After all this time, they're finally coming home." The modern geological survey that confirmed the site's authenticity also revealed something else. The land beneath the Henderson property contained significant mineral deposits that had gone undiscovered. During the original territorial period, Clayton Henderson had been murdering people for land claims that turned out to be far more valuable than anyone had realized, making the modern conspiracy's efforts to keep the truth buried even more understandable. Dr. Elizabeth Crow's ghost, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, worked carefully to preserve every detail of the crime scene. "This level of preservation is remarkable," she explained to Attorney General Crowfeather. "The dry conditions and the way the bodies were buried have maintained enough evidence to prove not just who they were, but how they died. We have clear evidence of gunshot wounds, blunt force trauma. This was systematic execution, not conflict or disease." Agent Cross had been arrested at a roadblock 50 miles from Redwater, his expensive suit and federal credentials unable to protect him from charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The satellite phone in his possession contained communications with political figures and corporate executives whose own arrests would follow in the coming days, but it was the discovery of Cross's family connection to the original conspiracy that provided the final piece of the puzzle. Vincent Cross was the great-great-grandson of Samuel Cross, one of Clayton Henderson's key associates in the Western Development Consortium. The conspiracy had literally been kept in the family, passed down through generations, along with the responsibility for protecting the stolen wealth. 5 generations. Attorney General Crowfeather marveled as she reviewed the evidence. 5 generations of covering up mass murder and land theft. The legal precedents we're setting here will reshape how we handle historical crimes and their modern consequences. Miriam stood apart from the official activities, watching as teams of experts carefully documented crimes her family had committed more than a century ago. The weight of generations seemed to lift from her shoulders as the truth finally emerged into daylight. But she also felt the enormous responsibility of being the Henderson heir who had chosen justice over family loyalty. Scout pressed against her leg, sensing her emotional turmoil. He'd been through everything with her: the discovery of the safe, the research into family history, the confrontation with forces that wanted to keep the past buried. Now he seemed to understand that their shared ordeal was finally reaching its conclusion. Henry Blackwood appeared beside her, leaning heavily on his walking stick, but smiling with satisfaction. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. "Eleanor always intended to come back and make this right. She just ran out of time." "How long have you known the truth?" Miriam asked. "My whole life. My grandfather was there when some of the murders happened. He was just a kid, working for the Hendersons, but he saw things no child should see. He spent the rest of his life carrying that secret, and he passed it on to my father, who passed it on to me." Blackwood gestured toward the excavation site. "But secrets like this are poison. They eat away at families, at communities, at the land itself. The only cure is truth. The legal ramifications were already beginning to unfold. The original Henderson land claim, validated by the territorial documents Miriam had found, established clear title to hundreds of thousands of acres that had been illegally seized and sold over the past century. Every subsequent transaction based on those fraudulent titles was now subject to legal challenge, creating the potential for the largest restitution settlement in American history. More importantly, the descendants of the murdered families would finally have legal standing to reclaim their ancestral lands and receive compensation for more than a century of lost inheritance. The Running Bear family alone was entitled to mineral rights worth tens of millions of dollars based on modern surveys of their original claim. What happens now? Miriam asked Attorney General Crowfeather as the sun began to set over the Henderson property. Now we build cases. Criminal cases against the living conspirators, civil cases for land restitution, federal cases for violations of tribal sovereignty. It will take years to sort through all the implications, but the foundation is solid. Your evidence makes conviction and restitution virtually certain. As the official teams began packing up their equipment for the day, Miriam realized that her life in Redwater was ending. She could never return to the quiet anonymity she'd enjoyed before opening that safe. She was now the most important witness in a case that would reshape Montana's legal and political landscape. But for the first time since her mother's death, Miriam felt truly at peace. The burden of family secrets had been lifted, replaced by the satisfaction of justice, finally served. Eleanor Henderson's daughter had succeeded where Eleanor herself had failed. She had chosen truth over comfort, justice over family loyalty, and the future over the past. 6 months after the truth emerged from that rusted safe, Miriam stood in the lobby of the newly established Henderson Heritage Foundation, watching as families from across the region gathered for the first annual memorial service honoring the victims of the Western Development Consortium. The foundation occupied a beautiful log building on the original Henderson property, built with funds from the liquidation of assets connected to the historical conspiracy. Scout, now sporting a new leather collar with a brass nameplate reading Scout, Guardian of Truth, moved comfortably among the visitors, accepting gentle pats and treats from children who had heard stories about the brave dog who had helped uncover their ancestors' fate. His instincts, which had first led Miriam to the safe's secrets, seemed perfectly suited to his new role as the Foundation's unofficial mascot and therapy dog. The transformation of Redwater had been dramatic but necessary. Mayor Thompson and 3 city council members had been arrested for their roles in the modern conspiracy, replaced by tribal representatives and community leaders committed to healing the wounds of the past. Joe Parker's general store now displayed historical photographs documenting the area's true history, including images of the families who had been murdered for their land claims. The mass grave site had been converted into a memorial garden, with individual markers for each victim and a central monument bearing the inscription, "In memory of those who died for the land they loved." May their sacrifice never be forgotten, and may justice, though long delayed, finally bring peace to their spirits. Sarah Running Bear had been elected to serve as the Foundation's first president, bringing decades of experience in tribal governance and natural resource management to the complex task of restoring stolen lands to their rightful owners. The legal processes were moving slowly but steadily, with courts throughout the region grappling with the precedent-setting cases that would reshape property law for generations. The most remarkable thing, Sarah told a group of visiting journalists, is how quickly the land began to heal once the truth was acknowledged. It's as if the earth itself had been waiting for justice. Indeed, the environmental restoration of the Henderson property had proceeded faster than anyone expected. The contamination from Vincent Cross's illegal mining operations had been cleaned up with surprising ease, and the natural ecosystems were recovering with remarkable vigor. Scientists studying the phenomenon had no ready explanation, but the tribal elders simply nodded knowingly and spoke of the power of truth to heal old wounds. Miriam's own transformation had been equally dramatic. The modest cabin where she discovered the safe had been replaced by a comfortable home designed to accommodate the steady stream of researchers, journalists and family members who sought her insights into the historical conspiracy. But more importantly, she'd found her calling as a coordinator between the various families affected by the crimes, helping them navigate the complex legal processes required to reclaim their inheritances. The new safe in her living room was a far cry from the rusted monster that had started everything. This one was modern, fireproof, and designed to protect the growing collection of documents and artifacts that continued to surface as the investigation expanded. But its most precious contents were the letters from families who had been reunited with their ancestral lands, expressing gratitude for the courage it had taken to choose truth over comfort. Miss Hale, a young woman, approached as the memorial service concluded. "I'm Jennifer Crowdog, Joseph Running Bear's great-great-great-granddaughter. I wanted to thank you for giving us back our history." Miriam smiled, noting the family resemblance to Sarah Running Bear and the quiet dignity that seemed to run in bloodlines that had survived genocide and systematic oppression. "Your ancestors gave me back my family's honor. I should be thanking you for accepting my apology on behalf of the Hendersons." The criminal trials were scheduled to begin in the fall, with Vincent Cross and 17 co-conspirators facing charges ranging from attempted murder to violation of federal racketeering statutes. The evidence from the safe had proven so comprehensive that most defendants were negotiating plea agreements rather than risk decades in federal prison, but the civil restitution cases were proving even more significant. Early court rulings had established that the descendants of murdered families were entitled not just to their original land claims, but to compensation for more than a century of lost income and mineral rights. The total value of the settlements was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, making it the largest restitution case in American legal history. Henry Blackwood, now in his mid-80s but still sharp as a mountain winter, served as the Foundation's official historian, documenting stories that had been passed down through generations of families who had never forgotten their murdered relatives. His office was filled with photographs, letters, and artifacts that painted a comprehensive picture of the Western Development Consortium's crimes throughout the American West. "The beautiful thing about truth," he told visitors during Foundation tours, "is that it never really dies. It just waits underground, like seeds in winter soil, until the right conditions allow it to grow." As autumn settled over the Montana mountains, Miriam often walked the memorial garden with Scout, reflecting on the chain of events that had begun with $20 and a leap of faith. The rusted safe that had seemed like worthless junk to the townspeople of Redwater had contained treasures beyond measure. Not gold or silver, but the truth that could heal generations of wounds and restore justice to families who had waited more than a century for vindication. The Henderson family curse, it turned out, had never been supernatural. It had been the weight of unacknowledged crimes, the burden of stolen wealth, and the poison of secrets that grew more toxic with each passing generation. The curse had been broken not by magic or ritual, but by the simple act of choosing justice over family loyalty, truth over comfortable lies. Eleanor Henderson's daughter had succeeded where Eleanor herself had failed, not because she was braver or stronger, but because she had lived long enough to see that some truths are more important than personal comfort, some secrets more dangerous than the risks of revealing them. And as Scout dozed contentedly in the afternoon sunshine, surrounded by the laughter of children whose great-great-grandparents had finally come home, Miriam knew that her mother would be proud of the choice she'd made. The safe had been opened, the truth had emerged, and justice, though long delayed, had finally found its way home to Montana's beautiful, haunted mountains The Foundation's work would continue for decades, but the most important victory had already been won. The victims had been remembered, their families had been restored, and the land itself seemed to breathe easier, knowing that its secrets were finally safe in the hands of those who would honor them properly. Sometimes, Miriam reflected, the most valuable treasures are the ones that cost everything to claim, and the most meaningful inheritances are the ones we choose to give away.